shooting in manual mode with your camera. So you might find it real easy just to put it on auto and click the button and be done with it. But even if you like shooting in an auto mode, you need to understand what the camera is choosing for you. Override it as needed. However, I highly recommend you going more towards shooting in manual so you can be in control of the camera and make the setting choices yourself. You might, for example, get some pictures sometimes that look out of focus, and you think they're out of focus, but most of the time it's because your camera picked too slow of a shutter speed, and the shutter, the camera open, you moved a little bit, it closed, and the picture looks out of focus. Or you see pictures that have this really blurred out, nice background behind portraits, and you wonder why when you take pictures you see all these branches and trees and it's not blurred out because your camera is picking too high of an f-stop, too much depth of field. And so, again, if you were picking the f-stop, you'd be able to control that. Or maybe you're getting pictures that the quality doesn't look that great. It's flat, it's dull, it's sort of grainy looking because the camera might be picking too high of an ISO setting. So, and we'll teach you about manual exposures. And what happens is on exposure, there's three combinations that create the exposure. There's the shutter speed, there's the aperture, and also known as f-stops, and there's an ISO. So the three of those together create the exposure. So on your camera, on the back of the LCD, often or sometimes on the cameras on the top of the camera, you'll see a display that will show you what your shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO is. And so the shutter speed and an example, an icon example, these are fractions of a second. There's a curtain inside the camera that opens up, and this is how long the shutter is open. The f-stop, when you see the F and then the number, that's signifying the opening of the lens. There's these different opening settings on the camera, a lens, and so there's like this little diaphragm that opens up and closes down, and each little f-stop setting has this number on the lens that represents how much light it's letting in. And then the ISO is the sensitivity. And all three of those all relate to light. So a stop, that's what everything refers to. It's a measurement of light. And so with the shutter speed, f-stop, and the ISO, there are different measurements that's adjusted, and they all relate to a stop. So when we start metering in a minute and talking about that, it's all relate to this is one stop, two stops, three stops, too much light, or too little light. And so we will make adjustments accordingly. About the shutter speed. So I mentioned that it has this curtain in the camera, which is the shutter is opening up. And the shutter is all about motion. It's about freezing motion on maybe sporting events. It's about creating artistic motion sometimes where you see like waterfalls blurring. But right now, I call those more creative controls. But I'm going to refer to the shutter speed, ISO, and aperture as more of exposure control here because we're just talking about manual shooting. So if you kind of a lightweight type lens, never go below 1/60 shutter speed, 160 shutter speed. If it's kind of a little heavier professional camera and you have a little medium-sized lens, I would say 1/125. And if you have more of a longer telephoto lens, 1/250. Those are the numbers to not go below while you're hand holding. If you're using a tripod, you can definitely go lower. But right now I'm talking about hand holding the camera. And so light, when we talk about opening up or stopping down, can be adjusted with shutter speed. If you have a higher number, that's less light coming in, so you're stopping down. If you went to a slower shutter speed, it's letting more light in. And so as you adjust, even if you get a good exposure, all three combinations, and then you adjust one, like you went to a sporting event and you went to a faster shutter speed and had less light, then you got to compensate with either the f-stop or ISO. So the aperture, these are settings that would be among different lenses, and every lens are different. There's more expensive lenses that let a lot more light in. There's more economical lenses that becomes more of a challenge in low light situations because it doesn't let as much light in. But these are the settings that represent how much light. So if the meter is saying we don't have enough light and we're going to open up, it's going to a smaller number on the aperture. It's letting more light in. Or going to stop down, it's letting less light in. So here's an example of some lenses. You can see where they're opening up. F4 letting a lot more light in than F22. It also relates to focus because there's something called depth of field, which is a amount that's in focus in front of and behind what you're focusing on. So the portraits with the big blurred background have what they call shallow depth of field. If you're doing a landscaping, want everything in focus, then it's more depth of field, so you'd want a higher number. So I tend to shoot people. So I tend to shoot most of the time with the smallest f-stop possible. The advantage of that is also letting the most light in, because we're trying to keep our ISO as low as possible. So if you're shooting the shutter speed as slow as you can get away with hand holding, you're letting the most light in with your shutter, your camera. And if you shoot with the smallest f-stop, if you like shallow depth of field, then you're getting the most light in there, so that will keep your ISO low. So let's talk about ISO. These are numbers at the top represent different ISO settings possibly on your camera. Every time you double an ISO, it equals 1 f-stop. Or if you cut it in half, that's 1 f-stop. So on your meter, if it said -1, that means you had 1 stop too little light, and you were on ISO 200. If you doubled it to 400, that should be a good exposure. If you were on 200 and said +1, you took it in half, that should be good. So doubling it and taking it in half, it's equal 1 f-stop. So let's kind of practice here. So get your camera out, put it on M on the knob on the top. That will set your camera into the manual mode setting, so you can start metering and controlling, measuring the light, and setting all the exposure controls yourself. First though, on the meter, you might have to look in your manual under metering, but spot meter is where I want you to adjust the setting to. A lot of times it's defaulted to something like a matrix meter. It's basically measuring the whole scene. And I don't want everything to be fooled. The spot meter is a lot more accurate. You might have gone to the beach before and shot a picture and it came out dark because all this bright sand was filling the meter. Or you could be photographing a dark person in dark clothing and it looks washed out because the meter gets fooled again. So the spot meter will be able to pinpoint where we want to measure the light at. So change that setting. And then you'll see on the back of your screen, probably you can see your exposure of the meter setting, but especially if you look through the camera, push the button halfway down, and you should see this little grid across the bottom, or maybe the right-hand side. There's like a 0, and these little hash marks, and a 1, and hash marks, and 2, and hash marks, and 3 on the plus side, and also the minus side. So that's when it's measuring. It's telling you you have 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, too much or too little light. When you're metering, the camera thinks the whole world is 18% gray. That's what it thinks a perfect exposure. That's sort of between a light and medium gray. So if you looked at something and kind of visualize it in gray, you're trying to put that spot meter on something, it's just a light tone, light to medium tone, and that will be the most accurate way to put your meter. And once you put it on there, then what we call zeroing out the meter. So if you had it and it said -1, you need 1 stop more light because it's telling you have 1 stop too little light. You could double your ISO. What we do is we pretty much do all our exposures with ISO for the most part, because we are putting the most light in with our shutter, the most light in with our lens, and then we pretty much zero out our meter strictly with ISO and maybe tweak it a little bit with shutter speed. And so after we do an exposure and the camera says, okay, it's 10 and 0, so there's no hash marks to the right or left of the 0, and the camera saying it's a good exposure, I take a picture, and then I pull up what's called a histogram. It's a little graph. Usually it's the wheel on the back of your camera, you use the top or the right, you push it and you come up with a little graph. That's the best way to judge your exposures. And you really need to get used to doing that, because you can't be outside on a sunny day putting your hand on your LCD screen trying to judge your exposure. So you're trying to get something that starts from the left-hand corner and goes all the way across to the right-hand corner. But a lot of that depends on how much color is in the scene. Sometimes you might only have 1 little peak total, then you'd put it completely in the center. You want the little mountain peaks to be pretty much balanced in the center. Here's a picture that's too dark. I mean, it looks obviously too dark here, but if you're outside on a sunny day, it might not look so like it's too dark. But if you see a gap on the right-hand side, that's telling you it's too dark and you need to open up and let more light in, which most of the time in my case would be taking the ISO up. But you can adjust it with your f-stop and shutter speed as well. picture's too bright, you're going to see a gap on the left-hand side of the histogram. And sometimes you don't see literally a gap, you just see all these little mountain peaks, heavy right or heavy left. So these little mountain peaks are all heavy right. Even if you see some going across the bottom, that's the same thing as a gap on the left or right. This will be your best exposure guide. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use that histogram as a guide, and that's what's going to get a good exposure. And then putting all these together, you're going to be able to take control of the camera. And what I do is this is not real technical. You get there and you do it in a minute. I put the camera, I measure the light, I zero it out by adjusting my ISO, I take a picture, I look at it, I might make a little tweak, maybe I take one more picture and look at it, and then I'm ready to go, and I don't think about shutter speed, f-stops, and ISOs. I just become a creative photographer and I start shooting. Now I'm aware of the lighting. If all of a sudden the sun's popping in and out of a cloud, you got to readjust things as the light changes or you move to a different scene. But figure that out in a couple minutes, then be a creative photographer and don't let the technical things overwhelm you. But then you will be in control of your camera and you'll get much, much better photography. Hope that helped.